In October 2021, Canadians were faced with a sticky situation. A shortage of labor and skyrocketing demand for the precious product of Quebec's sugar maple forests was threatening the nation with a case of bland pancakes. That's right, thanks to the disruptions inherent in the COVID-19 pandemic, the country's maple syrup supply was running low. The stakes couldn't have been higher, yet panic didn't set in. Canadians, you see, are always prepared when it comes to syrup. The maple syrup mafia, a trade group of maple growers that cooperates to maintain the precious syrup supply, were able to step in, providing at least 25 million kilograms of sweet maple syrup to the nation's bottlers just in the nick of time, averting the crisis. This was thanks to the Canadian Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve, a privately held and heavily guarded compound in Laurierville, Quebec, that helps maple syrup producers maintain control of the syrup market. For in Canada, he who controls the syrup controls breakfast, and he who controls breakfast apparently rules all. Syrup is to the Canadian national identity as cheese is to the French. It is a fact of Canadian life, and one that they're proud of. The maple leaf even adorns their national flag. First produced by Iroquois people long before the British and French colonized Canada, maple syrup played a key role in the establishment of Quebec, initially as a French colony and later under the British Crown. Known for its savory, smoky flavor, real Canadian maple syrup is expensive to produce, requiring about 40 gallons of sap for every gallon of finished syrup. Considering that a single tree may produce as little as 15 gallons of sap a year, this makes maple syrup one of the world's most expensive and time-intensive agricultural products. Maple syrup is one of the world's most expensive food staples, costing consumers as much as $125 on average per gallon in North America, where Vermont's producers compete with Quebec syrup to keep prices reasonable. Around the world, costs can be considerably higher, which may be one of the reasons that countries such as the UK and Australia have long found table syrup, a form of imitation maple syrup made from corn or cane sugar with maple flavoring, to be a more affordable option. Yet in Canada, most particularly, table syrup is derided and mocked as a pale imitation of the real thing. You're not a real Canadian, they say, unless your breath reeks of maple. In a way, then, Quebec's highly protectionist economic policies when it comes to syrup have helped maintain true Canadian maple syrup as both a gold standard in condiments and as a premium product anywhere other than Canada itself. While making syrup is relatively easy, involving just boiling sap in large vats and filtering out adulterants, harvesting maple sap itself is not a trivial matter. The entire supply was once collected by hand, tree to tree, using not much more than buckets and nails. A spile is installed in a hole in the tree to drain off sap. Still practiced by many growers, this old-fashioned tap and drain method is time-intensive, and the sap must be collected daily from thousands of trees. The sugar maple gives off lighter and sweeter syrup early in the harvest season, with darker, richer sap coming later as the weather gets colder. Today, industrial producers use automated pumps that drain the sap from the trees from underground, but the sap harvest can be affected by anything from too much or too little rainfall to the harshness of a winter or a late or early freeze. Thus, a tree's production can vary widely from year to year, threatening Canadian flapjacks and donuts with the possibility of a syrup shortage. The solution, simple and yet effective, can be found in a fortified warehouse, where nearly 200,000 barrels or 45 million kilograms of sweet maple goodness is stored under lock and key, guarded by heavily armed security forces. Forming part of a 267,000 square foot compound about as large as 5 football fields, the Laurierville plant and warehouse where the sugar is stored also produces a large portion of the nation's finished syrup. Run jointly by a controversial trade cartel creatively dubbed the Federation of Quebec Maple Producers, the facility stores up to half of Canada's entire yearly output on site in 45-gallon barrels painted a pristine white to allow any leaks or damage to be easily visible. The syrup on site can reach in excess of 200,000 barrels. During times of low supplies, such as in 2021, reserves can be released to bottlers in a controlled manner. The facility, opened in 1966, helps to stabilize syrup supplies in Canada and around the world. The maple cartel is able to release syrup onto the market when demand is high, or if weather impacts the year's production figures. Due to the inherently unstable output of maple trees, certain years see oversupply of the stuff, while other years produce drastically less than the Canadians desire. Because the Federation cooperates in a central production and storage facility, producers are not competing for the sometimes limited supply of sap, and thus are able to ensure that factory employment remains stable and investments in machinery and forest operations never go to waste. Canada is far from the only country to operate such a reserve, although it is the only country to do so with maple syrup. We've previously covered how the United States has a secret mountain of cheese in Kansas City, Missouri, and there are indeed other such stockpiles around the world. Wine lakes and butter mountains in Europe, or vodka reserves in Russia, all exist, and they can be seen as something like a national security blanket to ensure order in times of uncertainty, putting paid to the saying that people are only 3 meals away from anarchy. While details on the security arrangements at the Federation facility are sketchy at best, when asked on a newscast about the security of the facility, a foreman told the reporter, "I wouldn't try to break in here." And with good reason. After all, as we'll discuss later, the Federation was hit a decade ago with a heist that saw them lose over 10,000 barrels of syrup. So, is the Federation really a so-called maple syrup mafia? Well, it depends on who you ask. A monopoly exists when a single company controls most or all of an entire market. A cartel, similar but distinct from a monopoly, is a group of companies that cooperate more loosely to control the production and the supply of a precious resource. Such cartels, whether legal or not, have operated in many industries, collectively controlling the supply of anything from oil to diamonds to even light bulbs. While it could be argued that the Federation of Quebec Maple Producers constitutes a monopoly, given that it produces the large majority of the country's syrup from one central location, the Canadian government's policy on maple syrup production is that it is a legal cartel, permitted to exist in order to ensure the orderly extraction of a precious resource. Maple trees are vital not only to the supply of maple syrup, but to the entire economy of the Quebec region. Other uses for the sap include as a coffee additive in braising meats, brewing beer, making herbal tea, liquor, vinegar, and even as a chewing gum. The native Iroquois once prized the dried sap for its pleasant flavor and medicinal effects, said to promote physical endurance and concentration. Despite the fact that maple syrup is highly valuable as an export for Canada, Canadians also eat more of the stuff than almost the rest of the world combined. While Canada produces over 80% of the maple syrup in the world, that's 13.2 million gallons in 2021, it exports just over 7 million gallons. This seems to suggest, though no official government data seems to be maintained, that Canadians eat upwards of 6 billion gallons of maple syrup every year. That's about half a litre per person per year. Maple forests are a finite resource, and competition might encourage a drop in quality as producers would look for ways to undercut the competition, all the processes that led to various imitation syrups becoming popular around the world, all except for in Canada. The syrup must flow, and so, similar to governments such as Italy with olive oil or Mexico with both tequila and Tabasco sauce, the Canadian government officially tolerates this market collusion in the interest of a high-quality syrup supply. Still, complaints of the heavy-handed tactics of the Syrup Federation have persisted over the half-century since its founding. Many paint the Federation as a maple mafia and the bootleggers and black market syrup producers as a resistance of freedom fighters. The Federation is alleged over the past 50 years to have created a maple syrup Gestapo which seeks out bootleg or fake maple syrup, guards forests to interdict pirates, inspects cellars and stores, and cooperates with Canadian Mounties to raid bootleggers, seize bank accounts, and organize syrup stings against black market organizers. Critics note that the cartel keeps prices high to juice profits and takes an extortionate 12.5% of the proceeds of all syrup sales. Whether you view the syrup pirates as noble warriors against the tyranny of the sugar barons or as common thieves, you have to admit that the entire situation is 100% Canadian. Last year, I actually published a video all about the July 2012 Great Maple Syrup heist, in which a small warehouse in the town of St. Louis to Blandford was taken for a whopping $30 million worth of syrup. The low-tech, low-speed heist involved draining thousands of barrels of syrup over the course of nearly a year. It all began when the cartel had run out of places to store their precious gooey gold and had settled on a nondescript and none too secure facility in St. Louis. The heist was masterminded by Avik Karen, the husband of a co-owner of the warehouse. He opened a dummy company in the same facility. The thieves then drained off some 2,700 tons of syrup over the course of nearly a year, replacing it in the barrels with water from a local pond. That syrup was worth as much as $30 million, yet inexplicably the usually astute Maple Mafia was caught sleeping as the group came back time and time again for more and more syrup, eventually taking at least 10,000 barrels worth. Just to give you some idea of perspective here, a single barrel of the syrup weighs about 1/4 metric ton and has a value of upwards of $3,000 on the consumer market, perhaps $1,800 wholesale. That makes it 3 to 4 times as valuable as olive oil and between 25 and 50 times more valuable than the equivalent barrel of regular oil. The heist would have had to involve potentially hundreds of cargo shipments of syrup, not to mention transferring the contents of 10,000 barrels from original barrels to new ones. For this purpose, the conspirators even rented out a separate industrial warehouse. Luckily, the heist was an intensely Canadian affair carried out in secret, mostly at night, and it only ended when the thieves got exceedingly lazy and stopped refilling the barrels from which the syrup had been stolen. Perhaps they should have left a sign on the empty barrels saying sorry. If syrup sounds like a difficult thing to steal and resell, well, you'd be absolutely right. The main challenge is getting the syrup out of Quebec, where it can then be layered into sales of legitimate syrup from other provinces. Once the syrup was siphoned off, it was put in new barrels and moved out of Canada through one of Quebec's most notorious illegal exporter barons, Etienne Saint-Pierre, who relabeled the syrup as coming from New Brunswick, a far less strict province when it comes to syrup. The group was only caught when an inspector for the Federation arrived and, upon climbing on one of the stacks of empty barrels, found it collapsing under his feet. It would take the Federation weeks to discover the size of the heist, which ended up amounting to over 12% of their entire supply. The thieves made off with $18 million in proceeds before getting caught. Obviously, since then, the Federation has beefed up its security arrangements. Anyone with plans to tap their usual 200,000 barrels of precious maple syrup would be met with the most Canadian of welcomes.